That's how I think. I would not have believed it had I read it. Right, like something. Got you. Right, this is all I do. Oh, dear God. Recall. Please recall. Hello.
You guys ready? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me first say that as a mother, a wife, and a resident committed to the city, living in the heart of West Baltimore, I'm heartbroken and angered by the start of this year and the senseless violence that has continually taken the lives of far too many in our city. Our babies, our seniors, teenagers, shot in broad daylight, all well-meaning men, women, and children whose lives were violently cut short because of another person's cold-hearted behavior. I know firsthand that void that's left for many families and how profound and debilitating that can be. And the pain can be far too deep to fully encapsulate in words. But as your state's attorney, I want to reassure the citizens of this city that my office remains committed, fully committed, to prosecuting those who are responsible for bringing this unspeakable violence to our streets. We often hear about when murders and shootings are committed, but we don't often hear about the outcomes for those that commit these offenses. To that end, I'm here with you to provide an update on some of the most recent homicide case outcomes coming out of my office. I'm extremely proud of my homicide prosecutors, most of which are in this room and standing behind me, led by Head Division Chief Michael Dunty, all of whom stand here today and are not only on call 24 hours a day, but manage up to active 30 homicide cases a year and 20 open investigations, some up to 10 cases simultaneously. And despite the courts being intermittently closed for the past 2 years, we often forget that. The talents, the skills, and the commitment of my prosecutors have already secured 14 homicide convictions in 19 cases since March 8th, when the courts finally opened back up following a global pandemic. Some recent examples of those homicide convictions include, just yesterday, Jerome Collier was found guilty of first-degree murder, use of a firearm in crime of violence, illegal possession of regulated firearm, wear, carry, transport of a handgun in relation to the fatal shooting of an individual at the corner of Fulton and Westwood Avenues in October of 2019. Collier will be sentenced on May 6 and faces life plus 25 years. Assistant State's Attorney Amy Brown prosecuted that case. 2 days ago, Corey Smith and Brian Campbell were found guilty of first-degree murder, possession of a handgun in the commission of a crime of violence, illegal possession of a handgun with a disqualifying conviction, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder relating to the 2019 fatal shooting of an individual in the 1200 block of Druid Hill Avenue. Smith now faces life plus 20 years in prison, while Campbell faces life plus 35 years in prison. My Deputy State's Attorney of Operations, Noel Newman, prosecuted that case. Last Friday, Marvin Fry and Dania Smith pled guilty to several charges relating to the fatal shooting of an individual in the Shipley Hill neighborhood. Their accomplice is still awaiting trial. Fry pled guilty to first-degree murder and use of a firearm in the commission of a crime of violence and was sentenced to life, suspend all but 25 years with 5 years of probation. Fry is also obligated to serve 5 years on probation after his sentence. Smith pled guilty to accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Assistant State's Attorney Chandrea Hanna prosecuted that case. That same day, last Friday, Darius Jones was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree assault for his involvement in the beating and subsequent murder of Mr. Guy Thomas in the 1900 block of Edmondson Avenue. Mr. Jordan was found not guilty on the homicide charges levied against him. His accomplice, who ultimately shot and killed the victim, is still at large. He faces up to 10 years in prison. Assistant State's Attorney Jeffrey Mailer prosecuted that case. Last week, Deontay Walker was sentenced to 60 years, suspend all but 50 years, for the murder of Justin Antonio Johnson. Walker was convicted by a jury in December of 2021. Second-degree murder, use of a handgun in the commission of a crime of violence, possession of a firearm and disqualified person, wear, carry, transport of a handgun in a vehicle, wear, carry, transport of a handgun on a person. Walker shot and killed this individual in the 1400 block of Fayette Street in the Douglas Holmes neighborhood. Assistant State's Attorney Dan Salem prosecuted that case. Also last week, Dan Juan McBride was found guilty of the retaliatory fatal shooting of Trevante Briggs in the Shipley Hill neighborhood. McBride now faces life plus 35 years in prison at his sentencing. This week, the week before last, Keith Gladden pled guilty to the fatal shooting of Dontrell Tolliver in East Baltimore. Surveillance footage captured Gladden shooting the victim, who was on the ground after being pistol whipped and shot by an accomplice to the murder. Gladden was given a life sentence to spend all but 50 years for first-degree murder. Assistant State's Attorney Alyssa Ragland prosecuted that case. Many of you all can recall the dreadful killing of Fabian Mendez in Highlandtown last year. Mr. Mendez was carjacked, then run over and dragged several blocks to his death in a crime that shocked the city. Last week, 2 weeks ago, 2 juveniles pled guilty to the murder and were sentenced to life in prison, suspend all but 30 years with 5 years probation. Last month, and I have to say Liz Stock was a prosecutor in that case. Last month, Keith Smith was sentenced to life plus 3 years in prison for the fatal stabbing of his wife, Jacqueline Smith. And many of you can remember this case because he created an elaborate cover-up scheme to cowardly blame panhandlers in Baltimore City for the horrific stabbing of his wife. Chandrea Hanna also prosecuted that case. Transparency and accountability are key to breaking down the barriers of distrust in law enforcement, which is why these 2 functions are a testament to my office's continued commitment to the pursuit of justice for every resident in our city. And whether you acquire the transparency that we offer through our website, our cumulative annual report, our interactive data dashboard, or our Court Watch app, rest assured that my office will never give up on our fight for justice for all victims, because nothing is more important than that. Thank you. I'll take any questions. Yes?
Can you talk about the process of, in the cases where there were acquittal or the state didn't, win the charges that they set out to prosecute and win?
So,
what the process of review is like in those cases? I mean, it sounds like everybody has a really stacked docket. How do you review the cases and figure out, how to do better next time?
So what I can say is that my prosecutors work really hard. We work with the detectives at the outset of when a homicide takes place. As I stated, they are on call 24 hours a day. We work with the collaboratively with the detectives to steer the investigation and to figure out who we need to prosecute. And we feel confident at the point that we indict the individuals that we have the right individuals. And what I can say is that my prosecutors deal with some unprecedented challenges. If you can imagine, in the city of Baltimore, which is the home of witness intimidation, where the stop snitching mentality began, constantly we're dealing with uncooperative witnesses and victims. And so even despite those hurdles, we get out here every single day and we give it our all. And so, yeah, more recently there were about 3 acquittals, but we have about 14 guilties up on that board that haven't necessarily been reported in the same way that the acquittals are reported. Next question. Yes.
You mentioned earlier, I think you said your prosecutors have about 10, they can have up to 10 cases at once. Do you feel like you have enough prosecutors in the homicide unit?
So that was one of the reasons why we actually wanted to fully staff our homicide unit and the policies that we came out with coming out of a global pandemic where we needed to prioritize our cases and we were going to stop prosecuting minor offenses so that we can redirect our resources. We are fully staffed in the homicide unit. Again, I have the most talented prosecutors. We have over 300 homicides a year in the city of Baltimore. And so your national average for a prosecutor should be about 20. On average, my prosecutors have way more than that. They have about 30 active cases, and that doesn't include their investigations. But they're the hardest working prosecutors in the country. Next question.
Madam State's Attorney, do you
Yes.
have any comment at all on your trial being postponed?
So what I would say is I would refer you to my counsel, A. Scott Bolden, on that matter. Next question. Yes?
You talked about, obviously, the issue with witnesses in cases that go wrong. What about situations where, issues with the police work are highlighted? Is that something that you go back and review and try to figure out how to avoid a mishap in the future?
Of course, especially when it comes to homicide cases. And I'll even defer to Michael Dundee if you'd like. Did you want to respond to it and the way we work?
I certainly can.
So, but we work with them on a day-to-day basis, and we do it at the outset, especially around homicides. And so, because of that collaboration, we feel confident at the point that we bring a case and a charge against an individual that is the individual that is responsible for that homicide. Mike, you can add whatever else you want.
I think, as Ms. Mosby indicated, it's important to recognize that every homicide that happens is immediately assigned to one of the prosecutors standing behind me or standing behind you. And they work tirelessly with the detective to ensure that the work that's being done will stand up in court under scrutiny. And so, yes, the prosecutors work from the jump with the detectives, and also we review how that evidence plays out in court. And so one of your examples is if a witness doesn't cooperate or there's something that did not come off in court as well as we thought it would come off. We have to be creative in the way that we try to prosecute these cases. And so it's a collaborative effort from day one.
Yes.
In that same vein about witnesses, do you feel like jurors are more skeptical of police and prosecutors at the moment in Baltimore City?
So the one thing I will say is that we've been through a number of challenges in the city, right, that has a direct sort of impact on trust in law enforcement in our communities. If you think about just in the past 7 years, from the untimely killing of Freddie Gray to the 163-page Department of Justice report that outlined a pattern and practice of discriminatory enforcement of laws, against poor black and brown people in the 8th largest police department in the country, to the federal consent decree, to also having to my office playing cleanup. My chief deputy was responsible for playing cleanup for one of the largest police corruption scandals in the history of the country, where we had rogue police officers planting guns and drugs on citizens for decades. Then we're coming out of a global pandemic. So when you talk about all of these issues, it directly has an effect on trust, not just with the individuals that are on juries, but with the community at large, which is why we have to do better to change the culture and ensure that we get cooperation from victims and witnesses of crime. Is that it?
Actually, I want to ask one more thing.
Sure.
I want to circle back to something Alex asked, was that, in some cases, I think defense attorneys are eager to pick out investigative shortcomings. So I just wanted to ask again, do you ever feel like detectives in the Baltimore Police Department are doing their very best at investigating these cases, to completion?
So the one thing I will say, and I will also defer back to Michael Dunty because he deals with the homicide detectives in BPD every day, they are some of the best and the brightest in the country. And the same way that we have to handle and deal with uncooperative victims and witnesses and communal distrust is the same way that they have to try and solve cases every single day. And I can tell you that my prosecutors are on call working with these men who are just as committed as my prosecutors are, men and women. Did you want to add anything? Thank you, guys.